So what's some of the data? What surprised you about some of the findings?
So I think one of the things was, hey, the ongoing debate on does it really help to be asking these qualification questions, or maybe we are actually endangering deals by asking too many questions. So I think the first thing here, and this is of course broad strokes, um, asking qualification questions increases the win rate by 25%, right? So what we mean is like, hey, if you were to look at a deal like where people were not asking qualification questions and say you were getting, I don't know, like 10% win rates, versus if you were to look at all conversations where qualification questions were being asked, you would actually get like a 12.5% win rate versus, your baseline of 10%. So, I guess the first thing is let's just all get on board and making sure that we understand the importance of qualification questions. And then I guess the next one is among all the qualification questions, which one comes up most? Do you want to take a guess, Jason, on that?
It's probably either budget or authority would be my guess.
So the answer is actually timeline. And
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, my hypothesis is that it's probably somewhat easier to ask that question because so authority is actually the one that people in some sense do the least
Yeah.
because they're just I think they sometimes find that it might be perceived as being rude or like questioning the signing power of the person you're speaking with.
Yeah.
So yeah, timeline's the one that comes up the most.
Let's talk about BANT. So you consume a lot of LinkedIn content. I know you post a lot of LinkedIn content as well. What's the general consensus on BANT with the sales leaders that you interact with? What do they think about BANT?
I think it's probably one of the more controversial topics, right? On the buyer side, people think that they are being interrogated, and I think on the sales leader side, they always feel that if you don't have the basic qualification criteria, then you're wasting your time and theirs. I think my personal take on it is I think it's helpful in making sure that you are talking to the right audience, but how you do it and how you get the answers is important. And yeah, I think overall data supports that getting the right type of qualification in helps you in just making sure that you actually have overall better win rates. So why not?
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the data because I guarantee you there's people listening to the podcast right now and they're like, wait, what? They're going to talk about BANT? You know what I mean? So let's unpack the data. You want to give us some perspective on, what you sampled here? I think this is a whole year's worth of data or something like that you guys compiled. But yeah, give us some context on the data and the sample size and the time frame and all that kind of stuff before we dig in, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at an entire year's worth of data, right? And this was 3.8 million minutes of calls. So 200,000 calls. And over a period of 12 months across many different types of customers. So, if you think that you have a very unique process, of course, we are going to be talking about averages here, but a lot of different types of sales processes are being represented in this like 4 million odd minutes of calls.
And when you say many types of sales processes, are you referring to the sales motion as in it could be an SMB sales motion up to an enterprise sales motion and sort of everywhere in between?
Exactly. Yeah. So we see, people doing different sales cycles, different ACVs, and also, just different handover processes, right? Like it might be just singly handling the deal end to end, or it might be SDR to AE to, pre-sales handoffs. But yeah, all of those types of things are included in this.
Got it. And I'm really curious just because there's an overwhelming amount of data. I would assume that you guys could work through. How do you even decide what you're going to analyze, in the data? How do you even decide where to start when you do something like this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think what we try to do is we try and focus on, what is it that we are trying to answer in through the analysis, right? So if we are looking for signals which are more later stage in the funnel, then maybe we only want to look at conversations which resulted in a deal, at least an opportunity being created, right? Versus if we are looking for maybe some earlier signs, then you could just focus on saying that let's only look at, say, outbound cold calls. Or if you're looking for an end-to-end perspective, then we look for, of course, calls through the journey from the first time you speak to the customer, that might be your qualification call or even your cold call, all the way to the time you close the deal with the customer. For this specific analysis, we are actually, most of the data is looking at customers and conversations that have gone through the entire life cycle, because then we are able to make better correlations with respect to, hey, how does this impact actually a win rate, or how does this impact, like, somebody even creating an opportunity out of it. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think the purpose of a lot of what we will talk about is just giving an overall perspective, but we sometimes go and do like different slices and dices based on ACVs, sales cycles, etc.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you guys found around qualification and BANT, and what did the data tell us?
Yeah, so I think the first thing here is just how often do people actually talk about it, right? Like you said, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And do people actually do, band style qualification? So of course, we are not necessarily saying like, people are hitting all of those four things, but, in one out of every three calls, people are asking qualification questions, which I think is a very healthy number, because we are of course looking at calls through the cycle, which means that one is, hey, people do ask these questions. Two, these are not questions that get asked just in that first call, right? So don't beat yourself up if you did not hit all of those four questions on that first conversations, but make sure that you're actually trying to qualify and understand the prospect through the journey. And I think in today's environment, as the markets are changing so much, people's own budget timeline, even the reason why they're buying your product might be evolving week on week. So it's important to actually revisit some of those questions. Maybe it's not just hit it one time and forget about it.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that one, I'm bringing this up, and two, just like discovery, you're always doing it. It's not something that happens in the first call or later on. It's something that you're doing throughout the entire process. So what's some of the data? What surprised you about some of the findings?
So I think one of the things was, hey, the ongoing debate on, does it really help to be asking these qualification questions, or maybe we are actually endangering deals by asking too many questions. So I think the first thing here, and this is of course broad strokes, um, asking qualification questions increases the win rate by 25%, right? So what we mean is like, hey, if you were to look at a deal like where people were not asking qualification questions, and say you were getting, I don't know, like 10% win rates, versus if you were to look at all conversations where qualification questions were being asked, you would actually get like a 12.5% win rate versus your baseline of 10%. So I guess the first thing is, let's just all get on board and making sure that we understand the importance of qualification questions. And then I guess the next one is, among all the qualification questions, which one comes up most? Do you want to take a guess, Jason, on that?
It's probably either budget or authority, would be my guess.
So the answer is actually timeline. And
Oh, really?
the,
Okay.
I mean, my hypothesis is that it's probably somewhat easier to ask that question, because so authority is actually the one that people, in some sense, do the least,
Yeah.
because they're just, I think they sometimes find that it might be perceived as being rude, or like questioning, the signing power of the person you're speaking with.
Yeah.
So yeah, timeline's the one that comes up the most.
Timeline. So these are questions like, when would you like to move forward, or when are you looking to launch this? What's the ideal start date, that kind of stuff. Okay. Yeah, I
Exactly. Yeah.
think that what's really interesting is the timeline piece. If we talk about that first, what percentage of the time, by the way, do you have that stat that people ask about it and what happens?
So 23% of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, so 23% of the time. And what's the correlation on this with win or loss rates?
Yeah, so this is again like a strong one on increasing win rate. So it increases the win rate by 26%, and it decreases the loss rate by 18%. So what that means is overall you're in a much better position um, to know that you'll follow up enough to close the deal. And I think in today's environment, maybe that's even more important because we know that timelines are getting extended, but having a realistic expectation on what that timeline is helps salespeople stay on track, right? What we are seeing is if people were previously selling a product in like a 4-week sales cycle, today that sales cycle might be closer to 6 to 8 weeks. Now, if you're going in with the same expectation of saying, let's just, if I'm not able to close this in 4 weeks, then maybe the deal is dead. You're going to lose and you're going to have a lot of leaky revenue. Instead, if you were to actually set the right expectations, ask the timeline qualification question, then you're much more likely to know that, hey, this is only going to close in 2 months, and so I need to follow up for that entire period.
Yeah. And when you say right now, are you referring to just the economy?
Yeah, just the
Yeah.
economy. We're definitely seeing some shifts there, and we can talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Does the data have any best practices around how to ask about timeline? Or do you have any recommendations? I mean, I have some thoughts obviously with that, but I'm curious what's the best practice just from your experience and from the data around what question to ask and how to ask it and that sort of thing.
No, so the data doesn't necessarily dig into what are the different options and do they play out differently. I would be curious to hear what you've seen.
Yeah, I love the like the working backwards from a launch date, you know? So hey, ideally, when would you like this to be in the hands of your sales reps? Or hey, ideally, when would you like that first training call with us to be? You know? Or a hypothetical kind of question. Hey, I know we're really early in the process, but let's say that you like everything that you have to hear and we move forward. Ideally, when would be the week that you would want to run the training? Just like working backwards from that start date. I like that kind of hypothetical because you're acknowledging that the deal is not closed and just making it a little safer, to kind of answer. But that's typically what I do and what I advise. But I find that a lot of people don't really talk about timeline very much. You said it was 23% of the time. I'm surprised well, I'm not surprised actually, but 23%, I see that. I'm like, God, what are the other 77% of people doing if they're not asking about it? you know,
Yeah,
this is the one thing that you can do to build urgency most of the time. You know what I mean?
and it's definitely much more important to build urgency right now. So when COVID started, when we did a similar data analysis to just see what was impacting close rates the most, what we realized was that it wasn't so much people pushing back on budget, but it was a lot more people wanting a longer timeline to make their decision. And I'm assuming we are going to see the same thing play out right now with there being a different type of uncertainty. So I think more than ever, it's important to make sure that we get those timeline questions. And I like your phrasing because it's kind of a presumptive close to some extent, but it's also much more of a I'm putting yourself in a future state and like helping you imagine like what does this look like. And I think for any types of questions that we ask the customer, the more we can do that, the more it kind of makes it real for them to say, hey, this is what it'll look like if I was to start using the product.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I call it pre-closing, the reason why I like to ask those questions is oftentimes it invites some objections too. You know? So they might be like, well, we're still talking to another person about XYZ, and then we can talk about that. It gets a lot of the stuff out in the open when there's some sort of timeline, to work from. Um, so this is really interesting. So, okay, so timeline. If we kind of start to unpack, do you think it'd be a good idea to unpack maybe the other parts of BANT and how people do it, how often it's brought up, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we can definitely talk about a few of those, and I think also a few of the other signals that we thought, you know, really stood out and might be useful for the audience. What we discovered, and therefore I might stay away from talking a little bit more about the budget pieces. Um, like the budget piece is changing a lot in the current environment. So maybe it makes sense to look at it from the standpoint of today versus like last year's data, because I think people's perspective on that has changed quite a bit. What we do see is like authority is the one that struggles the most in terms of reps asking for it, and it was only being asked in like 7% of the deals. And of course, but when it does get asked, right, it is one of the things that not surprisingly increases your win rates by close to 30%, right? Because then who is the person you need to engage in the deal cycle. And the sooner you do that, the better for you. Because otherwise, if you're waiting all the way until the end and you're just asking the person, hey, who do I send the contract to? Then that's probably not a good sign.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it does is it, again, similar to the previous data, it does also reduce the loss rate by 20%. So, you're much more likely to know where you stand in the overall picture scheme of things.
Yeah. So, okay. This is an interesting one. Do you guys have data around multi-threading?
Not right now. I don't have data on like looking at deals which have multi-threading. But yeah, maybe that's a good follow-up segment that we could do. Especially, I think, then breaking it up by deal sizes, of course.
Yes, I think that would be really interesting data because there's some interesting conversational intelligence data around multi-threading, and it's all pretty conclusive. It all kind of says the same thing, that the win rates are higher and the deal sizes are bigger when we involve more people early, especially early in the process. But the
Yeah.
authority piece, do you have any recommendations? And again, we can just kind of go back and forth on this if you want. I think the biggest thing is that people are uncomfortable to ask because they don't know how to ask. you know, about it. Do you have any guidelines or best practices that you recommend around how to have this conversation in a way that doesn't alienate the prospect?
Yeah, I think one way to talk about that is probably less threatening is asking them, hey, is there something else that you bought? If you already know, like they mentioned that, hey, we also bought this other tool recently, you could just actually ask them, what did that buying process look like, right? Like who else was involved? And that then becomes like them telling you a story of something that they recently did, and they're much more likely to just go back, think about all the details, and they themselves might actually come up and say, you know what, maybe it's a good idea to include A, B, or C in the next conversation that we have, or let me bring these other people into the demo that we are doing. So I think that's one way that I've found helpful, and not that threatening.
Yeah, I love that. That's the go-to. Asking about the buying process for something that's similar, or something that's kind of the same. Hey, last time you guys did this, what did that process look like? It's a really good way to kind of unpack and that sort of stuff. Another thing that I like to do too, it depends on the rapport that you have with the prospect, but after that initial intro call, I could be like, Shruti, so on the next call, what I was planning on doing was giving you a quick demo just to show you how we can, help you solve all of those problems and help you accomplish the goals that we talked about. Assuming that you really like what you see, what would happen next if you guys wanted to move forward? And just get
Yeah,
them to
that's
kind of envision that future state, kind of thing that you talked about earlier. What would that be like? And oftentimes they'll talk about who else they would need to get approval from or what the process would look like and, all of that kind of stuff. Um, is there any other place that you see reps make a mistake when it comes to when it comes to this?
Yeah, I think the agenda setting piece is pretty interesting, right? So just to kind of double click into that, the last time around we did this analysis, we were seeing people doing agenda setting much lesser. It was like, less than 5% of the conversations that they were having. I don't know if it's us or if people have just gotten better at it, but we are seeing that happen in 16% of all the deal conversations in our data set from last year. And unsurprisingly, right, like, and this could be like what you said, it could be setting agenda for your next meeting ahead of time as you're setting up next steps, or it could be agenda for the meeting that you are on. And again, you could be using that agenda setting to also say, hey, this is what we are going to talk about, and if all of this goes well, then this would be the expected next step. I think that really helps people also just put in their brains, like, what is going to happen, what do I need to be doing during this conversation. Otherwise, it's very easy for people to just sit back as the buyer and be in the, I'm going to eat the popcorn and enjoy the show, right, while you're doing the demo and all the talking. And this is one of the most impactful things that we've always seen. It increases the win rate by more than 50%. In some cases, close to 100% win rate increase. So I would say, like, this is the one thing. Like, if you're not doing anything else, make sure that you're setting agenda, and you're setting it the right way. You're using that as the time to actually get engagement and buy-in, from your prospect.
Yeah, this is another one of those very basic things that I cannot believe that you said 17% of people are setting agendas now. Is that what you said, or 13%?
Yeah.
17.
16%.
Yeah, 16. I'm like, dude, 84% of sales reps start a meeting without setting an agenda. It's insane. That's so crazy. What best practice here from your standpoint? What should we be addressing in the agenda?
So I think it's useful to get the agenda as the way to define what is the outcome from this meeting, not just, hey, this is what we are going to cover today, right? Like, it's useful to phrase that, hey, I will talk about the product. I'll show you how some of our customers use this. And if all of this looks interesting, at the end of the meeting, I would like to be able to figure out a way for you to say, set up a trial account with your team, right? Now, once you set that as the expectation, then the person is constantly thinking, am I ready to actually sign off on a trial, right? So you want them to be in the position where they are saying, I need to take the next step here, and what do I need to be able to make that next step happen? Rather than them saying, okay, let me just go absorb all of this information and then I will, take time later to think about it. You actually want to set the agenda to get people to start using that time that you have together to make the decision and ask questions that help make that decision.
Yeah, I think that's a super important part, is like the time check along with what the expected outcome will be. Typically what happens at the end of the call is one of two things. You're going to find that you really like this and you want to get started, in which case we could talk about that, or you might find this is not a good fit for you, which is totally okay. Again, I cannot believe that 84% of reps don't set an agenda. This is like one of those really easy things to do that will also help you get the authority stuff. Like, I love what you said there about getting them to think about, what do I need to make that decision on this call? And it really frames the entire conversation around that. Let's talk about budget. What are kind of the do's and don'ts around budget and talking about it?
Yeah, so I think what we are seeing, and I'm going to actually dive into a little bit of analysis that we did with just the data from the last 3 months, right? So we looked at data from October 2021 all the way to June of this year. And this is much more specific and relevant to saying, hey, how do I talk about budget, or how do I even navigate through some of these objections that might come up around budget during the current scenario of people being unsure about the economy, people possibly facing like budget freezes or being much more careful about budget than they were in 2021, right? So one thing that we are seeing is that, while people are of course worried about the economy, it's not coming up as much, right? So it's still coming up in less than like 5% of the conversations that people are having.
Yeah.
Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Maybe that indicates that things are not as bad as people are just being a little bit more paranoid. Or it could indicate that it's too sensitive a topic for them to bring up, early on in a conversation with a salesperson. But I think what that translates into for a salesperson is to, of course, not freak people out, but to actively talk about like budget and more specifically about ROI. So what we are seeing is that, when instead of like talking about budget, if you just lead with talking about, hey, this is how the product delivers ROI, that is something that helps people go back and, make a stronger case for your product, especially in these times. And so we are seeing that, customers and reps are bringing up ROI more than 15% more right now than they were earlier, which is good. And where they are bringing up ROI, it is increasing the win rates. Right now those numbers are still moderate in like the 5 to 10% range, but I think that might evolve over a period of time. We did see a pretty stark, change when people talked about ROI. At the start of the COVID pandemic, when again, people were uncertain, timelines were getting prolonged, and a lot of companies are also facing budget freezes.
So what I'm hearing then is that a way that we can talk about budget is by talking more about the dollars and the cents and the ROI and the return. So kind of the more logical side, of the sale, and proactively bringing that up. A question I find that's very obvious but very helpful to ask is, because everyone thinks about it differently, especially, I sell to sales enablement, and then I sell to sales leaders, and then sprinkled into there are sales development leaders. And they all think about ROI differently, especially enablement from sales. Enablement is very much it's less about the outcomes that the reps experience from the trainings and more about, do I have something that's repeatable? Do I have something that's going to be common language across all of the reps that we're working with that's going to allow us to reinforce through trainings? So just asking, how do you think about the ROI of something like this is really an interesting question to ask a prospect, because you'll find that people have different ways that they think about the ROI for stuff like this.
Yeah, that's true. I think thinking about ROI in terms of how your persona, like what is your persona's main KPI that they need to hit, probably is more helpful than thinking about ROI with a broad brushstroke just based on your product.
Yeah, no, definitely. So
also on the budget side, like we do see a 27% increase in win rates where people are mentioning budget, even if it's in a negative context, right? Like even if people are saying like, hey, this might be too expensive for me, or I'm not sure if I have the budget right now. I think what is most important is making sure that you understand where people are on the budget side so that you can address that concern head on. So yeah, definitely an important qualification question to bring up, but maybe in today's context, to bring it up also, as a way to identify objections that might be related to it, so that again, you're not waiting for it till you send the contract and somebody says, sorry, I don't have approval.
Yeah, I love what you shared there. The other thing that I find too is that getting the budget objection out early is, to your point from earlier, getting them to think about making a decision. And oftentimes this authority piece, if I'm getting a budget objection, I may not be multi-threaded or talking to the right person too. Most of the training engagements that I end up closing, the training was not in the budget to hire me. We were just talking to the right people, and I happen to be working directly with a VP, let's say, that's close with a CRO, and they can talk and get budget for the training. because I find that a lot of people, you're totally right. The win rates do. I tend to welcome budget objections because now we're having a serious conversation. This person's seriously considering, this. And then I think the key is getting the prospect to want to work with you to build a business case or to want to involve other people. I'm working a deal right now with a guy that's a new chief revenue officer at a smaller company. There's about 10 reps there. So he's kind of doing a lot of stuff. But we went from budget being the objection to now he wants to get other people involved in the company, like marketing and some of this other stuff, so that we can make a bigger case to get budget from the CEO. So it's really interesting that you mentioned that even when it's brought up in a negative context, the win rate still increases because people are talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit like, when you go window shopping versus when you actually go shopping.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're going to probably have a lot more questions. You're probably going to negotiate. You're probably going to, push back a little bit on the price that you hear. But all of those you don't do when you're window shopping because, you don't care about the price when you're not going to buy something.
Yeah. No, exactly. That's really interesting. So we covered budget, authority, the need piece. I feel like is probably the most obvious part of BANT. But what kind of findings did you guys have around the need piece? What did you look at?
Yeah, I must actually correct myself there. So the need piece is actually the one thing that reps are doing, the best at among these
Mhm.
four. When we look at need, we also look at it more from the lens of like, problem-based selling. Like, are you asking about, hey, what challenges you're facing, etc. So we see that happen in like 37.5% of all of the deals, right? So it could be basically people asking like, hey, what's your main challenge? What's the main problem that you're looking at?
Mm.
Things like that. And it's, one is it's easy to ask, right? Because um, that's like an easy opener. I think most people don't feel as threatened by it on either side, and that's probably why it's happening in roughly 40% of the calls. But the even better thing about it is that it almost doubles the win rate, and it also increases your loss rate by 30%. Now, the reason why the increase in the loss rate here is, I think, pretty important is because that means you're leaving less of your deals in limbo, right? You're getting more of them into a decision. And that's always good because then you know who are the people who are still alive in your deal pipeline that you need to be
Yep.
following up with and talking to. So incredible stats then 92% increase in win rate, 32% increase in loss rate.
Wow. Yeah, this is let me know what your sense is, but my sense is that reps, especially from this data, they tend to over index on need and they focus a lot of the conversation on that when it's really just like if you had to weight BANT, how would you weight all of those? All of the criteria, actually. Maybe that's a more interesting question. How would you weight the importance of each part of BANT?
Um, so I would say need is almost the foundation.
Yep.
Because once you understand need well is when you can really do a good job with trying to create urgency because then you know how it fits into everything else that they're trying to do. And then, of course, in getting the right language in place for talking about budget and ROI. So I think that it's very very foundational. The mistake that people make often is they will ask that first level of question about, hey, why did you, for example, book a meeting with me today? But what they don't do is they don't do a good job of actually teasing out like the real reason behind it, right? Like,
Yeah.
somebody might actually book a meeting saying, hey, I was just in the market looking for, say, new technologies in the sales tech domain. But now that has not yet answered your question on what the need is, right?
Yeah.
You might actually discover in a lot of cases, and if you can do that, that means you've done a good job, is that there's probably a personal motivation why the person wanted to do this right now, right? It might be related to them having a change in role, or it might be related to them aspiring for a new role and trying to look for a new mandate for themselves within the company. Now, if you're able to actually understand all of those dynamics and then correlate your solution to that, then that will really, really give you the upper hand in winning that deal.
Yeah. So getting to impact, if someone says, "Oh, hey, I'm taking this, I'm looking to do some technology." Well, it's like, why? Oh, some of our reps aren't hitting quota. Well, what's the impact of that? What's quota attainment like? What are your goals over the next 6 to 12 months? Kind of getting and unpacking all of that stuff is kind of what I'm hearing from you. So if we step back, like when we look at, qualification as a whole, what does the data tell us around doing this? Like if we combine all of these stats kind of together, do we have like a macro stat around, hey, if you do these things, here's what the win rates and loss rates will be? Do we have anything like that if we're looking at it more in a macro kind of scale?
That's an interesting one. So you're saying if I do all of budget, authority, need, and timeline, what happens? No, in this study we haven't done like a study across all four being getting ticked off. But that would be an interesting one. And I think part of the reason why we haven't done that is because sometimes these four get covered in different parts of the deal cycle.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat harder to maybe bring all of that data together.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would definitely be interesting to look at.
Yeah. God, there's just so much data. It's like, where do you start with this stuff? Is there I think what we could probably spend some time on here. What is some of the preliminary data that you're starting to see around the economy and recession and all of that kind of stuff? I know you guys are starting to look into.
Yeah, I think there's been definitely a lot of talk around things going down, right? And we are seeing the impact of layoffs, right, beginning to happen already. So, some of that, I think everybody understands that there is a downturn, right? What people want to understand is the severity and the length of it. Of course, it's anybody's guess how long this might last. But I think in terms of severity, what we are seeing right now, and that's maybe the silver lining here, is we are not seeing people talk about it as much, right? So it's still,
No.
I would say, a lot more in in their mental space, but not maybe the top of mind. Unlike when COVID was happening, that was the thing that everybody was talking about, right? Like, and
Yeah.
it was definitely top of mind for everyone in every conversation. Right now, we are seeing that happen, like downturn or economy being brought up in calls, but it's still in less than 4 to 5% of conversations. So I would say that's good, right? And what that means is that while we don't want to brush that right under the carpet, we can feel a little bit more positive that, hey, if I can show value, I think I can find budget and I can close the deal. We are seeing where people are talking about the economic downturn. The win rates are, roughly half of what they are in cases where people are not talking about it. So if you are happen to be in like situations where people are bringing this up more, right, or if there are industries and verticals within within the segments that you sell to which are being hit much harder right now, maybe it's useful to go back and rebalance that a little bit, right? Like if there are industries that are maybe less impacted, go and focus on them for now. And if you do come across those objections, I think you have to be prepared that the outcomes might be less likely in your favor than they were historically. And I think for sales leaders, it's good to now begin to therefore make some strategic decisions around that in terms of, hey, which industries do I want to focus on? Right? Do I continue to focus on the same mix that I was doing earlier, or maybe there is a rebalance? Right. The second thing is like if I needed only say hypothetically like 50 sales qualified leads for each of my AEs to hit their quota. Now, how will that number change? Because the win rates are going to be lesser. So yeah, I think some strategic decisions definitely need to be made there.
Yeah, I definitely recommend for anyone listening to check out the episode we did with Todd Capone. He talked about that quite a bit. Like the firmographic focus, like you're talking about, looking at the industry verticals, who's the least affected right now, and like really double down on that. Adjusting messaging. You said adjusting the sales math, essentially. Looking at your conversion rates through the funnel, adjusting is necessary there. This has been really great. Is there any other findings, anything else that you want to leave us with before we take off? This has been, I love that we could go in and out of all of the data and talk about best practices at the same time. But anything you want to share or leave us with?
I mean, I think right now, in today's economic context, I think what is most important is for everybody to just keep a very close watch on their talk tracks and go back and iterate on it. I think the reps are getting better at doing some of the basics. Like, we've seen an increase in, like, say, even agenda setting. I know it's not, it should be 100% ideally for something like agenda setting. We've definitely had, like, close to 80% plus in terms of reps setting up next steps on meetings. So I think some of those basics we are all getting better at. But what is important right now is to keep a close track on what is the market saying, what are your reps hearing, and be willing to actually go back and change your talk tracks, change your approach, change your messaging, but also change your strategy based on the market realities. Like, don't be too harsh on your reps and say, hey, this was working last month, why is this not working now? Because a lot of things might be changing
Yeah.
in those conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Where can people go to get more information on Wingman?
Yeah, so Wingman is now part of Clary, so you can go to clary.com or trywingman.com. You can always find me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active, maybe not as active as Jason, but very much there. So just look for Shruti Kapoor and Wingman by Clary. You'll find me.
Got it. And this data, will it be made public? Will people be able to find it anywhere? What's the kind of scoop on that? Because I think you guys got a lot of great data.
Yeah, actually, we would be posting out the data. We are doing a weekly newsletter where we are bringing like one snippet of the data every week with a lot more color on, like, how do you actually make sense of that data? What are the best practices around it? So do look out for Wingman's weekly sales newsletter. But yeah, Jason, I think we'll be sharing some with you, and maybe you can help pass that along to your audience as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Check out trywingman.com. And Shruti, it was great to have you on.